Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Reinsurance Podcast, Bermuda's #1 business podcast.
No, number one podcast overall.
Is it now in Bermuda?
Yeah. God, we're beyond the days of business charting.
Whew, we are just universal chart topping in Bermuda.
Exactly.
It's a niche market.
A special, magical reinsurance market.
I am your co-host, Jared Lee.
And I'm your other co-host. Or maybe your primary co-host. Who knows? Where you start off.
Everyone's got their preference, I'm sure.
I like the British one. I'm the other co-host, Ben Reyes.
He's got that evil supervillain voice, and I can't see the extra letters he's putting into words.
So, if you're in Bermuda, as clearly many of our listeners are, how do you think British and American accents sound respectively? Like, because you're in the middle, I guess.
Yeah.
Like sort of hybrid.
I bet it's like a perfect blend of their experience, which is why we're so appealing to the ear.
Yeah, maybe that's why we do. Yeah, you're the best of both. Exactly.
It must be.
Yeah,
strong starting diversion. But what we wanted...
Where are we? Is this live? Is this thing on?
We're recording on location. We want to talk this episode about sort of the reinsurance placement process, this sort of journey that we finished the 1/1s, which are behind us now. We're approaching the 1/4 season, but kind of a sort of end-to-end tour of what's all included during these seasons. And I thought it might make sense then, if we're starting with the journey, like where do we count that journey as beginning?
Oh, opening with a controversial question.
Yeah.
I guess, okay, so we've got 3 stages we can at least agree on, right?
Yeah.
The pre-placement, the placement, and the post-placement.
Yeah.
I think whatever date I say, you're going to contradict me. So
That's the job.
effectively, the pre-placement sort of starts at some point during the post-placement.
Yeah.
There we are. I've turned a triangle into a slightly bent line. That doesn't really work either. But yes, basically, pre-placement starts very, very early.
Mm-hmm.
But probably in earnest, I would say, about 3 months before you want to actually start going to market.
Yeah.
And that's mostly data prep.
Yeah. Well, and I think we can make it controversial for the enjoyment of our listeners, partly because it will depend on what we're defining as activity. So the activity of what this renewal is going to look like is probably starting with data cuts and those types of things, because you're bringing together what you're going to buy the reinsurance on. But if we think about it from the lens of the relationships that you're managing during the process, what are the markets that you're going to present it to? What is their appetite? What is the client thinking about from their budget? All of those things might be a year or even longer from like we might be doing a combined peril layer this year. We talked about it last year. We never ended up doing it. So throughout all these conversations, the broker was maybe stress testing whether a combined layer might be appealing to their reinsurers last year, and it didn't get enough interest. They didn't go ahead with it. But now the conversations are maybe becoming a bit more fruitful. So on the layer and the appetite conversations, those are sort of multi-years in arrears at times, where they're building an assessment of the market that as they work with their client on their larger objectives, those things are sort of behind the scenes of that. But then there's this sort of starting gun of, all right, we need to take the data cut for this next, purchase, and then that may be where we traditionally start the process.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I guess probably relationships and data and everything that goes into this a year round, but they start to spike at certain times, right? So if you have a claim midway through the policy, you're going to talk to your partner. If you're at the same conference, or if you're deliberately doing a client visit, then you're going to see the client or the broker or the reinsurer at that point. But there are certain periods where it becomes more necessary to get started. Almost if you don't start in earnest now, you're going to fall behind and not be ready when it comes to getting the deal done. Yeah, I certainly remember on the relationship side, we used to almost do like a pre-renewals meeting, like you say. So for 1/1s, you'd almost have a get together in September and say, we're going to do some renewals together, us lot probably, us brokers and you reinsurers and so on, and all talk without really knowing about the deals we were actually going to do at that stage, because none of the data was ready. Nobody could say how those individual deals would work out. But we could say, how's the market looking generally?
Yeah.
How's appetite looking? What kind of things are you going to be happy or sad about?
Well, and that continual assessment of appetite and interest is always one of the most important things for that relationship to sort of bring to the fore is, do they want to do more in this class or in this geography? Are they trying to pull away from that? How are certain events or certain storms or these types of things impacting their lens on the world and what they might want to write going forward? There's always this need to have a really good understanding of where everyone kind of sits at any given moment.
That's amazing, isn't it? Though you think about it, the market maker challenge there that typically the broker has of knowing at all times what any given reinsurer's remaining capacity is, interest in certain lines, line size, areas where they can't really do much more, but also in a market where none of those reinsurers want to be too forward about what they're interested in and what they're not interested in, because it's a little bit closed doors. They might want to keep that to themselves a bit as well. It's quite a tough job.
It's a really tough job. And I think even within organizations, that information isn't really shared very easily. Even I think the bigger broking firms really aspire to have it where there's sort of centralized source of where markets sit and all these things. They don't do it terribly well, and I think it's hard to do. And I think a lot of practitioners in our space hold their relationships and their insights a bit private, because it's an asset that they have, which makes them more effective in the market than maybe counterparts. And the sort of politics around that sometimes even drive a bit of that, privacy even within their own organization, for whatever political reasons that they might have. So it's a really interesting dynamic as to how they're getting the most insight into the space.
Well, you can imagine there's probably an element of, there are some strong positions, but you don't want them to be weaponized against you. Mm-hmm. It's like, we look at every deal on an individual basis.
Yep.
And then somebody brings you a deal and says, you said you'd look at every deal on an individual basis. Like, damn it. And then they say, okay, we're only interested in property cat accounts. Like, you have to write this. This is the price. It's a large property cat account. You said you wanted it.
Yep.
Like, doesn't mean we wanted it at that price.
Yeah.
You said you wanted it. So, yeah, it's probably very difficult to manage.
Yeah, it reminds me, as a venture-backed startup, we sort of make this analogy a fair bit, but it reminds me a lot of venture capital firms when they look at startups. One time they backed a startup that was just an idea on a pitch deck. But they will universally say, we will look at every deal. We'll invest in companies before they even founded the company. Like, you don't though, do you? Like, the one time you did, but that was a real anomaly. And 99% of the time you do this thing. I think our industry is very similar in that there's a real aversion to missing a deal that you'd want to see. But you also don't want to waste your time on tons of stuff really isn't in appetite.
I'm massively fatigued by the number of deals I receive, and I'm also massively frustrated by the number of deals I don't receive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think when we look at where the industry goes in time, if you can make certain things more efficient, it will allow people to look at things, a broader selection of things, without it being too time consuming. Just so they could say they looked at it, without having to sort of reject it out at the outset.
There's some people who believe they see everything.
Yeah.
As well, right? You definitely meet some underwriters who are like, oh, no, I see the whole market. I know everyone. No deal doesn't go through me. You're like, sure?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anyway, we've got not very far through the pre-placement process.
No.
Part one of three
Part
in
one
this
of
episode.
three.
So
yeah.
So just trying to get us back towards that journey. We've got as far as brokers are all trying to keep track of reinsurer appetites. Reinsurers are trying to make subtle-ish noises about the kind of things that they want to do. And cedents have just started getting cuts of data. What happens next?
So then the cedents, there's a sort of a range in which they do this work themselves, but they'll get the data to a certain position and they'll hand that to their broker. And then you go through this collaboration phase where the cedents and their brokers sort of bottom out what the data is going to look like, the submission pack is going to look like. Once they get a lens on that, they're probably starting to have those reinsurer conversations in a little bit more, with a little bit more earnest at that point, but they're getting the data sort of finalized, they're having some early conversations, and they're beginning to get an indication as to what kind of structure they're going to try to take to the market. And this is sort of early quote indication type stuff.
Yeah, and it depends on the market you're in, but you do get those scenarios where the mini holiday starts. I'm being unkind. The trip to Oktoberfest that goes via the London market, for example, for North American clients, used to be a sort of standard procedure to go and see everybody in the London market and then go and see those in Munich and so on. We heard during the pandemic, people started skipping those, and even actually I thought it was quite innovative, doing a recording. So just recording the video of the usual Cedent to market meeting that the brokers would host. Because what it always used to be was, the broker would set up an office for the client to sit in, say, London, for example. The client would fly over and have their diary filled up with dinners, etc. And then all during the day, the various underwriters that were taking a share on that client's various accounts would come in for their annual sort of like formal meeting, sort of hosted by the broker. And the broker would be like, all right, client, do you want to tell the reinsurers how well you're doing? And the client would do a sort of like, well, we've improved our underwriting a lot. So those losses you saw last year, they're not going to happen this year. We're pretty sure about that. And then the reinsurers will try and stay their best friend, but also ask some challenging questions as well. So like, that's really good. I'm glad to hear that. But have you got that much confidence it's going to work? Because you did say that last year as well. Not to say that you're wrong, because we still want to get a 20% line on this, but
they're prodding enough to learn about the risk and about the development. It's interesting as we come out of the of lockdowns and travel again emerges, I think that will go away more quickly. But it creates an interesting environment of how much trust do you build with a pre-recorded message, and there's an element of sitting face to face and having this discussion. You get a lens as to this is a partner of your business for the next several years, versus I recorded a thing, right? And take it or leave it.
And also, so I don't know how much those recordings were stage managed by the brokers. I feel like I missed out on not being in the market during the pandemic and seeing all of these videos come in, because if they were each produced independently by each cedent without each cedent seeing each other's, you can imagine the range and sort of divergence in styles would be quite huge in like potentially a quite detrimental way sometimes. Like you imagine you got one client that's like very boring and like the reinsurer's like, oh my God, like
filmed on an iPhone SE in the basement somewhere.
Exactly, right. You got that at one end, and then you've probably got like ultra corporate video, and they're like walking around their head office into camera saying like, guys, greetings reinsurers, let us tell you about the bumper year we've had this year, kind of thing. And everyone be like, cue the inspirational music and end with a scene of the camera looking up to American flag. It could be heartwarming, but perhaps less credible in some ways as well, despite the best efforts. So.
It makes me wish we returned to a lockdown just to see a spike in video submissions.
Maybe they'll reach a certain point where they become, like fair game as archive footage or something. They can be released as non-sensitive information purely for, or even redacted in some way, so they remove all the numbers, but just for some kind of art project. Maybe we'll try and get some
if you have one of these videos in your inbox, send it to producer at the Reinsurance Podcast, and we will treat it with confidentiality, and we will be deeply enjoying our time watching these videos.
And then we will build a montage of a very artistic sort of blended set of cedent submissions during the pandemic to highlight the shared experience that we went through and our various ways of dealing with it.
So back to our journey.
Yes.
So we've got, they've bottomed out the data now. They have an idea of kind of various structures they might want to approach. They're approaching reinsurers to get indicative quotes or sort of a feedback on structure options. Usually at this point, it's only a select number of markets that have been engaged. It's the expiring leader or the aspiring leaders for this next year, markets that are sufficiently sophisticated to apply a price for what this risk or these risks should look like. And then the broker's feeding that back to their cedent around what they might be able to expect in the market.
And it's quite interesting at this point because the way the broking teams work and also the underwriting teams, they have a lot of hierarchy traditionally. So the heads of will meet with one another to sort of hold matters of state almost, and talk about the great long-standing relationship between our families in some way, right? It's perhaps a Freudian slip in some ways, for some truth in some cases. But
guess what show Ben's watching on Netflix right now?
But yeah, this holding court almost takes place between the reinsurers, the brokers, the sort of head class underwriter, let's say, and the main account manager for the client, let's say, at the broker. And then meanwhile, when it comes to actually getting what you've described done, they'll send off their sort of more junior brokers to go and collect quotes. And it's funny, in London it's very physical. Elsewhere it's a bit more email driven or phone call driven. But in London, at least in our experience, it was always great fun, because literally you'd sort of say, off you go get some quotes on this. The pack is ready, take it to this person, go and talk to them about it, and get them to come back with a quote. And the same for authorizations. When you're like, firm order terms, off you go and collect all of the authorizations, fill up this program as much as you can. You sort of lost then all track of how everyone was doing and where they'd gone off to, right? So we used to have, when I was sort of working with broking teams, a sort of daily stand-up where we check in and be like, right, account A, how many quotes have we got in? Or what stage is it at? Has it got past quoting? Are we authorizing now? How many authorizations have you got? And like literally people in the room going like, oh, I got 10% from such and such. Right, let me add that to the tracker. Yeah. And, I got 20% from, we had a conversation with this other one, and they're still thinking about it.
They're going to email us by the end of the day today with their...
Right. Yep. Which is actually really fun in many ways.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It drives, I think, some of the culture in those organizations as well. Yeah. Like who can go out and show their worth in many ways. But
we jumped over a piece, but I think this is when, so you have the data challenges getting data into the submissions. We've talked about that in another podcast. We might touch on it a bit more in this one. But one of the other things that creates a data challenge, especially at these higher level, more senior sort of heads of the family conversations, is the ability to have something of interest instead of just how did this one deal go last year, how much premium do we do, but having more granularity around that. I know that in both of our backgrounds, we've had times where we sort of try to pull together what is the relationship between tier one broker and tier one reinsurer, and getting them on the same page around what those numbers look like. But the more granular you can present information that matters to those meetings, the more they can begin to really look at what does success look like for both of them going forward. Because this is a model by which you're trying to find a solution that makes everybody happy. So they're looking at this bigger relationship going, well, we have you help us write this much business in these geographies, or if you're trying to push against them quite with a bit more challenge, having the data that says your quotes are 25% higher than the other tier one reinsurers, or whatever that data might be. And that's one of the first stumbling blocks that our industry really faces, is very rarely do they have the data in a way that they can really bring it and make the conversation as meaningful as they want it to be. I'm not to say that they're not meaningful. I think they really are, but it's the data that they wish they had to hand, right? It's data that they're trying to build systems to collect so they can have these conversations more impactfully.
Absolutely. And even looking at things like signing ratios. Yeah. Like why are you signing us down so much? Like in this region particularly. Yep. They're like, we don't like that underwriter. Like, oh.
Yeah. Well, and that's a really good example as well, because it's like, well, you're signing us down so much in this region, like, but are we? And it might just be the case that everyone's getting signed down a lot in that region. There's a ton of oversubscription. Yeah. And so it might be like they're signing actually better than everybody else. It's just they feel put out because they wanted 100% on most of their lines. They got 80 or whatever it may have been. So it's using it's the need for this data to actually add that additional color, right? Where you can sort of pull up a sheet, pull up a document and go, actually, compared to everyone else, this is what's going on. Or, yep, you've got a valid point. We've signed you more aggressively than other markets, and we can talk about the reasons we have done that. But without the data that drives those things, it becomes a much more difficult position to hold.
So we've jumped into the placement kind of at this point. So how does that? So we did the pre-placement. We're now in placement. How does that data get tracked at the moment in terms of who's quoted what, who's authorized what?
Yeah,
who's signed what?
Everything I've seen is in spreadsheets. And as you say, they have these sort of daily or weekly stand-ups with the team where they look at all the deals that are in flight, and everyone reports back to what they have. But then on an individual deal basis, you're going to have it structured where you'll have the various layers you're placing, and then all the markets you've approached, and whether they've come back or not, or they've declined it, or they've provided an authorization. You have your notes as to what they've said, and then you try to every night. Once the deal is really moving, you'll usually do nightly or every few nights updates to your client around here's what's updated, here's what's come through today. Sometimes you modify that a little bit so it's
trying to
softer.
Imagine, like how many different spreadsheets there must be, because like you have for one account, and by one account I mean for one reinsurance deal.
Yep.
So this client's got loads of deals, the broker's doing loads of deals, this broking team is doing loads of deals, the reinsurer's hundreds of deals.
Yep.
You've got the main broker for that deal, who's got a spreadsheet to track which quotes and authorizations and so on they've got. Then you've got their team leader who's tracking all of that team's deals. That's a duplicate, populated in these team meetings. Then you've got the cedents one, where they're sort of guessing at what maybe is going to be achieved, and as they're drip fed information from the broker, they fill out their spreadsheet of what they think their deal's going to look like. And then they've got many deals in their team, so a bunch of those. And then every single reinsurer, each time they put down a quote or an authorization,
track it in some.
Yeah, they've got to track their lines in a spreadsheet as well. And when they receive a signing, they've got to manually add that as well. And it's only, from my experience, once the contract is finally bound and then often sent off to an offshore team somewhere to be more affordably rekeyed.
Yeah.
It's only then after, 2 months after renewals that finally the core data systems are updated with these records. Yeah. And you get a view of your portfolio that wasn't manually constructed.
Yeah, I think a lot of the reinsurers will have a bit. I bet a lot of them will work on some centralized system just to make sure that they're staying on top of capacity that's been at least committed to places, and they'll have a better lens there. But certainly on the broking side, the final what got done is a month and a half, 2 months after the deal's done. On the cedent side, we know firsthand from clients who've talked to us that have said they don't get a full lens as to what their final, spend was or what all the deals were until another sort of couple months after the renewal gets finished. So you're going through that process. Everyone's updating this information each night, and then you get to the point where you're ready to do your signings. Again, back and forth between the cedent and the broker around who's going to get what, and you make these decisions again for any variety of reasons that they have to think through that. They issue all the signings through email, and they sort of sent over the final contracts to everybody, and we're sort of considering that deal for all intents and purposes bound. Everyone's on risk, and usually that's like the 11th hour on the night before the inception, and many times, and we've both seen this personally, where the deal's like everyone's like on risk, but the deal's not done for a number of days after the inception date. But it's something the industry's gotten comfortable with more broadly.
I think according to at least English law precedent, as soon as the authorization goes down, then they're on risk, and technically it's included, even though the paperwork's not necessarily finished. Yeah. So if you're listening to this, that's not legal advice, but you're probably okay. Yeah.
Which I think is why there's such a push on things like subjectivities, where they could then push back and say, technically, our authorization is nullified because, right, those types of things, because you're right, the law has them like where they could be forced to be on that risk, so they use those elements to give them a get out of jail card if need be. Again, not probably terribly frequently enforced. There's a number of times that claims have happened and people who were technically not on risk but were assumed to be on risk still pay the claims. Like the industry behaves very well in a lot of these scenarios.
Yeah, but I imagine everybody would quite like to have the contract certainty and stuff.
Yeah. There's a lot of talk about how do we get to contract certainty more quickly, and certainly people would prefer to have buttoned up a bit more than they always get it.
I mean, we've done a sort of speed tour there, which feels a bit incomplete in some ways.
We didn't even get to post placement.
No, exactly, and we should, because I think one of the things we want to talk about in a future episode is some of the manual bits of this industry and the data that leads to in terms of error-prone issues and so on. So perhaps we can cover the post-placement story within that, so making sense of the mess.
This wasn't even an intentional two-parter. But stay tuned for part 2.
Yeah. Part 2 of?
Yeah.
Who knows? We'll find out.
What a cliffhanger. That's why they love us in Bermuda.
Yeah. So they have lots of cliffs in Bermuda.
I don't really think so, do they?
On that bombshell.
Until next time.
See you soon.